The ceiling above Mara Voss split open like glass and snow. Light carved a jagged, crystalline wound as metal ribs screamed and the lab smelled of ozone and blood and something older, like the hush of glaciers. She could feel the heat of her own breath, hot and brittle against her teeth, as a shard of console bit into her forearm and the world narrowed to one precise, impossible thing: the emissary kneeling in the wreckage, its limbs splayed like a prayer, its head tilted toward her, and its voice spilling across the ruined chamber, not in words she had known, but in a sound that felt, absurdly, like the memory of life itself. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The emissary's tone was thin as ice and deep as an ocean trench. It threaded through the alarms and the wet clatter of the broken facility into Mara's ears with the intimacy of a confession. She was alone enough to hear her own pulse pound like an engine. Around her, the Arcus program's containment grid hummed, half dead. Beyond the broken viewport, Antarctic white stalked the horizon like a verdict. People screamed somewhere above, a human sound that made the alien voice carve into her chest with a clarity that felt like both terror and grace. "Stay with me, Dr. Voss," someone shouted. Elias Mercer's voice, rough as peeled bark and far too close. He appeared in the doorway, breath steaming, hands clenched around a pack that had once been too heavy to carry. He carried the weight of secrets with the same physicality he carried his kit, saturated, inevitable. He had the kind of tired that knows too many lies. Mara tried to laugh and coughed instead. Her forearm was slick, she could taste iron. Her mind, trained to dissect syntax and soundscapes, to translate the impossible into evidence, reached reflexively for the thing that had always steadied her: pattern. The emissary's utterance repeated, untranslatable and deliberately simple, like a bone returned to a child. That single breath of alien language folded into her, and for an instant she thought she was going to understand everything and nothing all at once. "Jonah?" she said, because the name was both plea and anchor, because the hybrid graft in Lieutenant Jonah Reyes had kept him alive when other bodies had been quietly given to the cold. Silence answered. Jonah was supposed to be in the medwing, monitored, a man who walked the thin blue line between human and something not named on official rosters. He was a living sealant. His immune rejection was a wound every technician watched. He had the hollow charm of someone who had been resuscitated by foreign hands. He moved like someone whose own body hummed with a foreign instrument. The graft kept Jonah alive and made him strange in a way Mara had once admired and then feared. Elias stepped closer, surveying the ruin with the expression of a man who'd learned to measure loss by the angle of metal. "Clear the perimeter," he ordered. "Secure whatever's left of the conduit. Voss, are you hit worse than this?" He tilted his head toward the cut on her arm and winced when she let out another soft, desperate sound. "I'm okay," she lied. Habit. Researchers always lied to their own bodies until the experiment finished. It's superficial. He didn't press. He only watched the alien in the wreckage, that impossible being that had burdened them all with a presence they had been trained not to trust. In the months since the Arcus program had been born of classified memos and midnight budgets, Mara had imagined this moment 1,000 times. A clean, brilliant encounter where she would finally put words on the map and give her sister back a place in the world that had decided to forget some names. Instead, the moment tasted of burnt metal and the iron sweet of human fear. "Dr. Voss, you know the protocol." A voice filtered over the comms, thin and bureaucratic, calibrated in a tone learned through years of power. And for once, Mara resented the safety of procedures. She resented their neatness while the world disassembled around her. "We need you to maintain a translation log. No direct communication without oversight." She laughed then, because there was something fundamentally comic about a protocol that expected clarity from such a ruin. "Oversight," she repeated. "The only oversight left is the sky." Elias' jaw tightened. Do it anyway. She reached for her recorder with the shaking precision of someone who had spoken to dead languages in dark rooms and coaxed them into sense. She had thought linguistics would be a beacon that would lift her beyond the tether of her sister's loss, beyond the whispers that the crash that stole her sibling had been covered up, partitioned into red folders that lined the shelves of the Arcus program's upstairs admirals. The craft had been recovered months ago, a dark sibling beneath the ice. They had promised diplomacy. They had promised mediation. Instead, they had delivered a census and a silence so deep it made Mara's chest ache. They had brought Jonah into the project for optics at first, an astronaut who had survived the crash that had returned with a booth of poison in his bloodstream, who had been grafted with alien tissue and kept functional by clandestine surgeons. He was both trophy and test subject, and to Mara, a person whose eyes sometimes slid away from her as if measuring what was left of himself. Jonah carried the graft in the quiet geometry of his face, a line of pallor that ran beneath his jaw like a seam stitched by someone who had not believed in stitches. Her sister's face moved through her mind, thin and insistent, a photograph in a file. Leela, who had been brilliant and irritable and always on the verge of discovery before the crash swallowed her. Leela had wanted to be seen, and she had been, in the worst possible way, fragmented into data and then redacted. Mara had signed onto Arcus because she told herself she wanted to map the emissary's intelligence. She wanted to prove humanity's capacity to connect. But under that professed noble motive lay something sharper and more animal, a hunger to be recognized beyond the shadow of the agency's assumption that her life began and ended with the label Voss, sister of. "Do you think the emissary will bargain?" Elias asked. The question came out of his mouth like a small grenade. He had been in the intelligence world long enough to know the shape of bargains, how they were made and why they always cost more than anyone predicted. He had been a courier for truths that dangling in his pocket had burned holes through his conscience. Mara's recorder clicked quietly as she activated it. Her fingers were numb, but her voice steadied as she spoke. "If they're here to bargain, they'll bargain from a position of patience." Her training surfaced. The visitor's articulation, the cadence of breath across unknown phonemes, the way meaning compresses in silence. Patience means data collection. It means they have not been rushed by planetary threat. They are not the kind of species that surprises. Elias watched her with a new intensity. Or they're lying. Or we're lying to ourselves. The admission was a clean blade, and for a moment Elias's stare softened. They were both culpable in different ways. She with her hunger to be seen. He with his pragmatic cynicism and a stack of dossiers that made him more enemy than champion to the truth. He had been an operative. She was a scientist. Both had signed on to Arcus because they thought they could contain the inevitable. The facility groaned around them, a wounded animal. Technicians in orange suits moved like ghosts through the smoke, carrying pieces of fiber and alien material wrapped in lead. A diplomat in a crisp black suit, one of the few who could still command a room on the basis of posture and pinned medals, approached, hands raised in the universal placation of bureaucracy. He was the emissary of the coalition, the man whose life had been built on the arithmetic of nations. He did not speak. He barely looked at the thing in the wreckage. For him, the visitor was a ledger entry. "Dr. Voss," he said finally, with formal sympathy, "we must proceed as planned. Containment first, extraction second, negotiation third. Or we die on a raised platform while the ice eats the containment bolts," Mara shot back. Her tongue was sharp, suddenly cold. She had rehearsed politeness for years. The wreckage had erased her patience. Elias stepped in between them, like something stopgap. "We need to secure the diplomatic conduit," he said. His voice had edge now, private and dangerous. "If there's one thing intelligence hates, it's being blind to the other side of the ledger. Let me run a sweep." The diplomat hesitated. "That's an authorization issue." Elias' stare hardened. He had been authorized in countless shadows. For a moment, Mara saw him as something other than courier, an old operative with a private ledger of regret. "Authorize me, or authorize someone who will tell truth when it matters," he said. "I work fast. I don't ask questions I can't answer." The diplomat's hand twitched toward his pocket. Someone above would need to sign. The decision felt like the hinge on which their lives balanced. Somewhere beyond the ruined lab, Jonah might still be moving. Somewhere beyond that, Lila's file sat in a drawer that would open or remain locked depending on whose face you preferred to believe. Jonah's voice, when it came, was the friction of a hand along stone. He emerged from the shadow of the corridor, ragged but upright, his uniform torn, a smear of blood at his temple. He had the look of a man who had been made of two languages and didn't know which one to speak. "I'm fine," he said, but his eyes were a map of conflicts Mara could read like an X-ray. "Jonah," she whispered, and the name rang. There was something about his presence that made the air cleave into a before and an after. He moved closer, and Mara detected the small, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through his limbs, the graft's ghost-like echo. He smiled a crooked line, a human thing that tried to anchor him to the species he was still meant to represent. "Tell us what you heard," Elias urged. Jonah's hand flexed. "It didn't speak at first," he said. His voice was thin, regretting it as it left. "It watched. It measured rhythms. Then it hummed something at me. No, to me, like a scale. It was not human sound. It felt like a weight. Mara's recorder never left her hand. She was a scientist, yes, but she was also someone who had held a sister's hand beneath the wreckage of disappearance and felt the terrible difference between being remembered and being archived. She had wanted to be seen whole, not as an appendage of tragedy. Now, between the alien's patient gaze and Jonah's fractured admissions, she felt the old hunger open anew, not for accolades, but for acknowledgement, to be recognized as more than a sister or a cog. "You're sure it wasn't echoing the graft?" Elias pressed. Jonah's jaw clenched. "I'm not a conduit," he said. The denial tasted like sacrament. "I'm myself. Sometimes I can't tell where the graft ends and I begin, but it didn't speak through me. It spoke to me like a census reads a census taker." The word lodged between them like a stone in a throat. Census. The connotation of an enumeration, cold, exact, without mercy, settled on Mara's shoulders. In the months of secret meetings and polished metal, she had suspected lists had been written. But hearing the syllable out loud turned conjecture into possibility. "Then we proceed with the protocols," the diplomat said. "Containment, translation, negotiation." "Translation requires truth," Mara said softly. Her fingers shook. She wanted to be the scientist who could map the sound and prove in equations and charts that humans were not mere bioresonant resources. The thirst for recognition, personal, professional, primal, competed with the knowledge that the very act of translation might hand over the key to a ledger she had not wanted to be counted in. Overhead, the ice complained like a beast. Outside the viewport, the world was white and infinite. Inside, the human voices reduced to a chorus of decisions. Around them, Arcus hummed with a kind of theological ambition. We will meet them, and we will do so on our terms. But the wreckage had other plans. The emissary, patient and alien, lifted its head toward Mara and made a sound that was not quite a word and was everything she had ever wanted someone to say to her in recognition. It was simple. It was a single sentence, though she could not yet parse it. It rolled over the wreckage like weather and tugged at the edges of her reasoning. Somewhere deeper in her, a memory of Lila shifted like sediment under ice. The sentence felt like an index finger pointing at the ledger of human life. Who translated it? Elias demanded. Who has the linguistic feed? We do, said Mara. She didn't know if she was speaking for herself or for the memory of Lila. The lab smelled of ozone and answers that had not yet been given. Her hand tightened on the recorder until her knuckles ached. The diplomatic envoy lifted his chin as if to claim control. You will proceed under supervision, he said. Arcus will mediate. Outside, the wind took another jag off the horizon, and the world went on being indifferent. Inside, the wreckage exhaled a sound that set the hairs on the back of Mara's neck standing up. The sentence unfurled in her head like a map she wasn't ready to read. It vibrated with a timbre that made her feel both small and seen, as though language itself was a mirror and someone had just told her what it reflected. She thought of Leela's laugh, sharp as a shard. She thought of the way Jonah's eyes held a softness that was always just at the edge of breaking. She thought of Elias, who carried secrets like stones in his chest. And in that precise, violent instant of clarity, when the lab was a ruined ship and the alien's whisper bent the world, I felt the old hunger shiver into recognition. To be counted is not the same as to matter. The sentence vibrated inside her skull like a tuning fork struck in a cavern. It did not resolve into meanings she knew. Instead, it laid out consequences, the way a cartographer sketches coastlines, sharp, absolute, indifferent. Mara felt breath leave her body, as if the cold had been siphoned from her lungs. For a long second, she had the insulting, private hope that the emissary had spoken something like apology made of syllables. Instead, it announced an economy. Specifications, Jonah breathed, and the way he said it made the word into an accusation. His fingers left a smear of blood on the sleeve of his jacket that looked like an editorial note. Elias moved with the practiced quickness of someone who could make decisions before they were given permission. He crouched beside the wreckage, eyes on the emissary, then flicked a glance to Mara. You understood something. I understood how it placed us, she said, the voice thin. Around them, men and women in orange suits exchanged glances that had nothing of the wonder they'd promised to the public. Faces that had once lit up at the notion of first contact looked suddenly tired, like people who'd seen a balance sheet and realized the cost. The diplomatic envoy's jaw worked. Protocol did not have language for this kind of cold calculus. The contaminants sweep continued. Techs in respirators filtered air and vacuumed fragments of the alien's skin into bags that glittered like oil. A translator team set up a string of microphones and holographic pads. Their leader, a woman Mara recognized from a briefing deck, tried to keep her expression in a professional, neutral plane. Her hands shook when she thought no one could see. We need to record everything, the translator said. And for the first time, her voice wasn't a practiced evenness. We have to capture cadence, pitch, context. If it's enumerating, if that was a census, then we have to know the variables. A census is data, Elias said. It implies classification. It implies extraction. Mara's throat closed. There were photographs in the literal drawers of Arcus, images of subjects measured under sterile light, biopsies cataloged and labeled, emotional responses quantified. Lila's file sat in a stack like a small, loyal hurt. Mara had thumbed it in secret and cursed the neatness of all those numbers that claimed to name her sister. To be catalogued was to be rendered useful. To be useful was not necessarily to be saved. "How do we even know what they value?" Jonah asked, and his voice betrayed the way his training refused to be fully scientific. He had seen what the graft did to his own system. It had made him both less and more than he had been. He knew what it was to be interrogated by your own body. Mara remembered a lecture she had attended long ago where a visiting linguist had said that when you encounter a new language, the first thing you learn is what it ignores. Human tongues are full of nouns for what matters to the culture that names them. If a people have 10 words for snow, it tells you what they live among. She had never thought they'd be cataloged for grief. Eli's hand found the edge of a console and left a smear of soot on the metal. "Look at their vocal apparatus," he said, because any detail was a lever. Not human, obviously, but the way it makes sound, staccato, then elongation, it's almost like it indexes time. Maybe they're listening for durations, for the arc of suffering. "That's speculative," the translator said. She put her hands to her mouth as if to stop the words that wanted to be softer. "We can't anthropomorphize." "Nor can we sanitize," Mara countered. The room felt smaller, as if the alien sentence had physically pulled the walls inward. If they value grief, if they harvest response because it amplifies something in them, then this isn't contact, it's cultivation. The diplomat tried to restore footing with a pronouncement of procedure. "We will proceed under coalition law, translation committees, bilateral observation, no unauthorized broadcasting, no external dissemination." Eli laughed without humor. "That's been the problem from the start, isn't it? Coalition law. This law lives in rooms where people decide what populations can be conserved and what can be harvested. They meet in hotels and call it policy. There are files that—" He stopped. The word files had the power to reopen a wound. Mara had seen Elias ruminate in ways that meant he'd carried documents in his head for years. She watched his jaw set. In the months before the Arcus program went public, he had been the sort of courier who had refused to carry particular packages. Or he had carried them and then written poems about how the tin tasted. "You have files?" Jonah asked. His voice was small. Elias's eyes darted to the diplomat as if sensing a forbidden tally. "Not just files," he said. "Networks. I used to move things between governments. There are contractors, private companies, that have been experimenting with alien artifacts for decades. They don't brief the public. They brief shareholders." The diplomatic envoy's expression soured. "Allegations will be logged and investigated if proper channels demand it." "We don't have time for channels," Mara said, and heard the raw edge of a woman who had pushed for years against obfuscation. Her hand clenched on the recorder until the plastic creaked. "If they're cataloging us, they don't need channels. They need an algorithm, a feed of emotional metrics. If human grief has resonance for them, we've been a resource long before the crash." Silence folded over them like a sheet. The technicians kept moving, their steps silent but decisive. Outside, the ice squealed in the wind as if it too wanted to be heard. Jonah's face, in the dim light, looked like a map of concessions. "If that's true," he said, and his voice scraped like someone who'd swallowed glass, "then everything we've been doing under the Arcus banner, diplomacy, mediation, has been curation for someone else's uses." Mara had spent nights imagining the moment of truth, the emissary speaking a sentence that would erase doubt and catapult humanity into a larger, kinder understanding. She had not prepared herself for the prospect that the sentence would be a ledger. There is a terrible privacy in numbers. They speak with the ring of inevitability. They make mercy into a budget item. "Do we tell the world?" the translator asked. Her hands were trembling now, which turned her professional poise into a human thing. If it's a census, if they're counting, people have a right to know. "Do you want mass panic?" the diplomat shot back. He was as terrified as anyone, but his fear wore the coat of authority. "We have to be measured. We cannot." "You cannot keep a ledger hidden when your ledger decides which people are expendable," Elias said. "We saw the indexes before. Certain regions, certain demographics. Some contractors ran tests showing higher yields in areas of high emotional density. They tried to monetize funerary customs and marketed them as resonant events." The translator made a small noise that might have been a sob. Jonah's hand went to his temple where the graft had been knotted under skin. Mara could see his pulse like a thumbprint under bone. "If that's true, then my graft, my existence has been processed too," he whispered, and the horror in his face was immediate, incandescent. He had not signed up to be commodity. Mara felt something she had not expected. Not anger at the emissary herself, but a cold, rising fury at the people who had treated humans as a supply chain. She thought of Lila's notebooks filled with ideas that had been shrugged away by grant committees and then taken, possibly, by contractors who could apply alien tech to them and never credit the source. She had wanted recognition for herself, but recognition that reduced people to resources was not what she had fought for. If the Arcus program was part of a system that had been quietly harvesting human affect, then her sister's disappearance might have been a line item. "We have to find the contract," Elias said decisively. "If private actors have been experimenting and the coalition has been complicit, it will show up in procurement. Names, transfer orders, odd budgets, there will be a paper trail." Jonah's eyes flicked to Mara. "You're a linguist. If we take this into the open, if we show the sentence, they'll try to recreate it. They will weaponize it." "That's what they're already doing," Elias said. "We don't weaponize a thing we don't understand. We weaponize what we classify." Mara's mind raced. She could make a choice that would change everything. She could translate the sentence publicly, provide the world with the alien taxonomy and the code of their interest. She could broadcast the ledger and force transparency. Or she could obey the diplomat's caution and stay tangled in the coalition's net, where truths sat like moths behind glass. Her hand hovered over the recorder, the plastic like a lifeline. The emissary's eyes, if they could be called eyes, tracked her with something that might have been amusement or the mild interest of a scientist examining a petri dish. It made her imagine herself as a specimen, a dot on a graph. She had spent her life turning unknown sounds into human meanings. She had built her career on the promise of telling worlds what other worlds meant. But what use was translation if the translation was used to grade the worth of lives? "You will be asked to follow protocol," the diplomat said again, now with a shakier voice. "Failure to do so will be considered insubordination." "Or cowardice," Elias snapped. "Which would you prefer, obedience or redemption?" The room held its breath. Outside, the wind keyed up, as if the sky had tuned itself to listen. Jonah's shoulders collapsed in a silent surrender that felt like both a confession and a prayer. He looked older by decades. "I can't be used anymore," he said simply. "If being alive means being a lever for someone else, I won't be that lever." Mara's own throat quivered. Here was the pull. ethics tugging at her need to be seen, loyalty to a sister who could no longer speak, and the knowledge that any action might have global consequences. Inside her, a calculus formed, raw and personal. If she published the sentence, if she named the ledger, she might save countless futures from being written as supply chains. But she would also expose Jonah and others like him to a world that would stare at their grafting as a method, a technology to be reverse engineered. "Then we choose," she said, voice clearer than she felt. "We either obey the coalition's slow, measured strategy and risk the ledger being spun into profit, or we force the ledger into light and give people the chance to refuse." Elias studied her like someone weighing a coin for counterfeit. "You understand what refuse means. Governments will not thank us. Contractors will come for us. The agency will call us traitors." "Maybe," Mara said. The thought of being branded a traitor tasted bitter and metallic. Her mind wandered to Lila's face in the file, to the small, fierce way she had insisted the truth mattered. "But my sister's ledgered," Mara said. "I won't let someone put a price on who she was." Jonah's hand found hers across the debris-strewn floor. It was a small, human gesture in the midst of arithmetic. "If you do it," he said, "do it knowing I won't run. Whatever choice you make, I'm with you." Elias stared at the join of their hands, at the human contiguity that refused to be turned into statistics. For a moment, he looked like the man Mara had first met, a cynical courier who had been hardened by secrets but still held an improbable capacity for loyalty. "Then let's find those files," he said, "and if we're going to break the coalition's little heart, we'll do it with proof they can't bury." The translator turned toward the emissary, fingers hovering above her equipment as if testing whether the alien would offer more. The being inclined its head very slightly, and a sound like 1,000 leaves turning at once brushed the air. It was not a sentence this time, just a cadence that suggested it had listened to the choice it had asked them to make. Outside, the Antarctic night began to bleed long and blue into the horizon. Inside, the small group formed a plan that felt at once impossibly naive and desperately necessary. Retrieve the documents, corroborate the ledger, and decide whether to burn the coalition down or force it open. The pull of fear and justice pressed at their ribs like a hand. The room held its breath, and then, inexorably, moved. Mara thought of the way words had always been her refuge, the mechanism by which she had claimed meaning from chaos. She swallowed and realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that this time words would have to do more than name. They would have to unmake arrangements made in darkness. The emotive hunger that had driven her career was now not merely personal, it was moral. She pressed the recorder to her palm like a vow. "Whatever we do," she said, "we do it together." The emissary regarded them as if it had been waiting for that answer the entire time. The lights hummed, the ice whispered, and a small human decision hung in the air like a single dangerous note. They were not only scientists, diplomats, or couriers. This moment remade them into insurgents of truth. The first pull had been toward disclosure. Now, as the second act of their lives tightened, they had to decide how to wield the knowledge that the alien sentence had given them, and how much they were willing to sacrifice to make sure humanity would be more than a barn of echoes for an indifferent cosmos. The translator's equipment hissed as if it too were uncertain of its role. Red lights blinked like warning stars. For a long, raw minute after Mara spoke, everyone in that room behaved like animals that had been startled awake from a stage-managed dream. Plans rearranged themselves in faces. The diplomat found words, and then swallowed them. Technicians moved with the mechanical calm of those who must keep things from unraveling faster than the mind can grasp. Then, the first fracture opened. A junior tech who had been sifting through the ash of a ruptured data terminal stepped back from the console, his mouth forming a small O of disbelief. "There's a communications packet," he said, voice high. "Encrypted, but it's recent." It came from a contractor node. Private incubation zone, Sector Delta. Timestamped 3 weeks ago. Elias' head snapped up as though someone had struck him. He moved with the fluid, impatient authority of a man who had once clasped the levers of secret transfer. "Show me." The tech projected the packet. Numbers bled into their peripheral vision. Codes, transfer amounts, a list of events labeled with innocuous names that meant nothing until you knew to read them as currency. Mara felt the room tilt. Jonah's hand gripped hers so tight she tasted metal. The packet was not just procurement. Embedded in its metadata were links, references to archived footage, to recordings of funerary rites, to investment portfolios named with clinical euphemisms, resonance trials, effective yield optimization, field test catalogs. A private company had been running what could only be described as experiments on population-level grief, funded through shell accounts and briefings titled to redact the moral cost. The contractor had used coalition cover for shipments of alien tissue. Lilai's handwriting in Mara's memory felt suddenly far less private. Elias did not pause. He started to run a forensic sweep, his fingers leaving scorch marks on the holographic console as he moved faster than procedure allowed. "They're trying to quantify sorrow," he said. "They've been building models. They want predictable harvests. Weddings, funerals, mass grief events. They map them, they simulate them, they optimize times and locales." The diplomat's face went white. "These are allegations," he said. "Present your evidence through the proper chain." "Proper chains presuppose good faith," Jonah said. His voice trembled like ice thawing. "We don't have good faith." Mara's throat felt raw from the silent scream she had not yet let out. All the neatness of scientific detachment she had clung to, language as neutral instrument, translation as offering, clattered like crystal on stone. The universe she had promised herself she could map was not simply cold and indifferent, it was being curated and sold. Leela had not been an accident in a ledgerless night. She might have been one of many data points in someone else's optimization model. "Who authorized the grafts?" the translator demanded, too sharp for a woman who'd lived by the rhythm of patient neutrality. Were the recipients volunteers? Were there consent forms? "No forms we can find," Elias said. "No proper institutional review board sign-offs. Those who should have cared, NGOs, oversight committees, got sanitized briefings. The contractor sent vetted reports. They make their results look like humanitarian projects." A tremor of anger, hot and bright, ran through Mara. She had wanted to be seen as more than a sister, more than a derivative of tragedy. The truth was uglier. They had been seen, counted, sorted, and the value assigned to them had been sold. "If they cataloged grief," she said slowly, "they must have cross-referenced it with biomarkers. What did they want? Hormonal spikes? Neural synchrony? The graft, Jonah. Did they measure the graft as a conduit?" Jonah looked away, as if the question were a knife. "They monitored my graft under sedation," he said. "They logged responses to stimuli. Sometimes I woke and didn't know if the sensation of loss I'd felt was mine or manufactured for their record." His voice broke. "They asked questions during simulations. What did your mother smell like? Describe grief on a scale. They recorded the pitch of sobs." The scientist in Mara recoiled as if from a lab table contaminated with a new toxicity. "They treated sorrow as resource," she whispered. "Not empathy, not trauma. Resource? People will say it's utilitarian, the diplomat muttered. That research is to understand cross-species communication. They will defend procurement and refuse to see moral boundaries. Then we break them, Elias said. And the words were not the same as the muttered fantasies people kept for evenings when the world felt merciless. This was a plan spoken with the clarity of someone who had seen too many papers burned and too many men justified. We leak the packet. We verify the contracts. We link the shipments to the coalition's accounts. We expose which governments signed non-disclosure annexes. We make this public. The translator's hands were no calmer, but her eyes were sharp. If we leak without corroboration, they'll call us fabricators. We'll be labeled conspiracy theorists. We need proof. Epidemiological tracebacks, procurement signatures, witness testimony. And we need to protect Jonah. Protect him how? Jonah whispered. By hiding what I am? By denying what was done to me? I can't be a martyr for paperwork. You can be your own witness, Mara said. The adamant tone took both of them by surprise. A small, frail force had hardened in her. Less the woman desperate to be recognized, more the woman who had watched a sister dissolve into redacted lines. You tell the truth about what they did to you. We bind those first-hand accounts to the packet. We make the moral case with hard data and human testimony. Eli's jaw worked. There are consequences. If we name names, contractors will be ruined, but they'll also retaliate. They'll have the means to harass our families. The agency will move to seize us. The coalition will declare an emergency. Then we prepare for that, Mara said. The recorder in her palm felt suddenly enormous, like an altar object. We hide copies. We secure redundant channels. We get allies out there. Journalists, NGOs, unaligned labs. We create a narrative they can't easily smother. We do not trust the coalition's processes. The room contracted inward, smelling of ozone and panic and an unspoken arithmetic. Risk now versus risk later. Jonah's face, lined with graft and betrayal, was a human map of what their choice would cost. He looked at Mara as if she were a lighthouse. I don't want martyrdom, he said again. If I testify, they'll dissect me into data. They'll treat my words as variables. We'll frame it as testimony, the translator said. We'll anchor it with the packet and the procurement list. We'll show patterns. We'll prove motive. And if they come for us, Elias said, we run. We have contingencies. I still have some contacts who owe me favors. Not all of them good, but some who are still human. At that, the diplomat's posture crumpled into a private despair. He was a man who had made his career on the assumption that nations could be balanced like checkbooks. If this goes public, he said finally, voice low, there will be chaos. There will be panic. The coalition will fracture. We might save some, but we'll drown many more in the process. Would you rather let them keep cataloging? Mara asked, and the diplomat had nothing to say. The fracture widened when someone else spoke, a voice that had been quiet until then. The translator's assistant, a small woman who'd been cataloging the emotive responses in their listening data. There are victim files, she said, surprising even herself. Lives they've experimented on. Names redacted, locations generalized. But there's a pattern. Families from certain economic strata, communities where funerary rites are public and amplified. Her words landed like stones. The implication was unthinkable. These were not random victims. They were chosen according to criteria that matched a cynical market logic. The contractor had been optimizing returns on sorrow, and in doing so had targeted the vulnerable because their cultural expressions produced higher yield. That's genocide by profit, Jonah breathed, and his voice had lost any remaining detachment. Elias looked at Mara as if the two of them were the last people who could do anything that mattered. "You wanted to be seen," he said, soft now. "You wanted the world to know you, not as sister of, but as Mara Voss. This is your chance to make the world look at who we have been becoming." Mara's hands trembled. The moment she had fantasized about, her name at the head of a paper that reframed human identity in a cosmic context, had curdled into an obligation she could not refuse. Lila's face came back to her in a rush so vivid she could smell the dust in her sister's hair. "I didn't sign up to be a witness," she whispered. "I signed up to be a scientist who would make meaning. But meaning is moral. If we don't act, others will keep making meaning that benefits them." They formed a plan that was more desperate than elegant. Elias would run a deep sweep to trace the packet's origin and find the physical procurement order. Jonah would go on the record with what he remembered: his grafting, the experiments, the prompts they put to him, under the translator's protection. Mara would compile Lila's file and connect the missing pieces. The translator would secure redundancies to make sure nothing could be easily erased. They would leak what they could to journalists who had reputations they couldn't buy. But secrets begat fractures. The diplomat, feeling the pressure of his office and the fear of systemic collapse, made a choice of his own. A covert report sent to the coalition's higher-ups, coded to sound like a request for more time, more oversight, but it contained a call for containment, orders that would pull Arcus's power away from the very people trying to expose the ledger. He rationalized it as damage control. He called it responsibility. To Mara, it read as betrayal. "You went to them," Elias accused when the report's trail was revealed. His face was a broken map of anger. "You sold us to committees because you feared panic." "I went to keep you from making a mistake that would cost millions," the diplomat said. "I was trying to prevent a gasoline fire." "You call secrecy prevention," Jonah said, pain sharpening him into honesty. "You hide while people are cataloged like livestock." Mara felt the room collapse into a triangle of blame. The diplomat watched Jonah with the helplessness of a man who had built his life on policy and found it incompetent in the face of moral calamity. Elias's eyes were cold as flint. "If they move to contain us, they'll take Jonah. They'll quarantine the emissary again and erase this whole episode. They'll bury the packet." The translator's assistant made a small, decisive sound. "Then we don't give them a chance. We move now. We take what we can, make copies, and we leave a trail that proves the coalition knew and ignored the danger." Elias shook his head, the scent of old regrets rising like frost. "This will call down agencies. It will call down contractors with silencers and money. Are you prepared to be hunted?" Mara thought of Lila's laugh and how it had once cut through a room like a bright blade. She thought of everything they'd already lost. "I am," she said. "If being seen means being hunted, then we will be hunted together." Jonah placed his hand over hers, a small human liturgy. "Then let them hunt. Let them look long enough to see that we are not statistics." The emissary watched them with an inscrutable patience, its body a map of lines that refused to become face. In the shivered light of the ruined lab, the group diverged. Some toward courage, some toward fear, some toward compromises they had not yet named. Secrets split them like ice underfoot. Alliances formed with the brittle urgency of those who understood that once a ledger was exposed, the world would have to reckon with what it had been made to mean. The fractures in that room were not only political. Jonah's declaration that he would no longer be used split his connection to the graft. Mara's choice to broadcast a truth split her from the illusion of a career untainted by moral compromise. The diplomat's covert report split trust until it lay in shards at their feet. Elias, who had delivered truths and carried burdens, found himself carrying a new weight, the knowledge that to reveal was to endanger those he loved. Outside, the Antarctic wind pressed like a hand against the containment viewport, as if trying to scrub the air clean. Inside, Arcus lights felt like the last watchful eyes of a world that had almost succeeded in making its most human qualities into commodities. The sentence the emissary had spoken lingered, no longer just a mysterious index, but a weapon and a wound. They had heard it, and now their lives would be the evidence for or against its calculus. They moved to action, not because they were sure they could win, but because the alternative, silence, was an acceptance none of them could stomach. The fractures widened around them, but within those cracks, new alliances kindled. Jonah's fierce refusal, Elias's weary courage, Mara's sudden iron will. The translator's machine tagged the emissary's cadence again, capturing the timber that had set their lives unmoored. If the world was to be saved from being a ledger, someone would have to risk everything to make the ledger visible. They had begun to choose. They moved like people who had rehearsed bravery only in their heads, fast, clumsy, certain enough. Mara's hands shook as she clipped a second recorder to her belt and handed a sealed drive to the translator. Elias moved through the lab like a man who had once opened safes for a living. He found a comms node and began siphoning logs. Jonah, pale and steady, went to the medbay and grabbed the patient manifests, his fingers working with the faith of someone fetching an old beloved tool. The diplomat hovered, torn between duty and shame. His orders had been a betrayal, but when push came to shove, he did not run. He stayed and helped seal exits, giving them minutes until the coalition's response could mobilize. They had designed redundancy, word by word, image by image, witness by witness. Jonah insisted on being recorded on camera himself, raw and unadorned, describing the graft, the tests, the lullabies turned into algorithms. Mara coached him gently, clearing the technical words until his testimony felt human rather than clinical. Elias ghosted the packet through a dozen anonymous nodes, fragmenting it into pieces that would reconstruct only if combined with the drives they were copying. The translator wrote legal-sounding summaries to bait journalists with reputations who would not dismiss data as conspiracy. As they worked, a quiet thing happened. Something like forgiveness slid between Mara and Elias. Not the clean, sudden absolution of plot, but a slow recognition of fellow sinners who had chosen together. Elias paused at her elbow, hands trembling as he fed a cable into a port. "Mara," he said, voice low, He swallowed the rest of the apology. There were things he had carried for years, small betrayals, papers he had delivered knowing what they would do. He had been hardened by secrets until he feared tenderness. Her reply was not words. She placed her palm over his forearm, felt the calluses and the scar from a rifle butt, and for once let her eyes speak. He understood. Jonah's testimony recorded like a confession. He described nights under sedation when technicians had asked him to cry, to remember a mother, to conjure the ache of a funeral. Then they logged his physiological peaks. He spoke about waking to doctors who smiled as if proud, as if they'd invented a crop. When he finished, his voice had been emptied into a kind of prayer. Mara stepped forward and kissed his forehead, an impulsive, utterly human seal of solidarity. It was small and fierce and cost nothing but everything. Jonah closed his eyes, and in that private fold, he stole a moment of belonging that no ledger could catalog. They moved as a unit toward the comms array, the translator feeding Elias a list of live journalists vetted for integrity. Elias hesitated only when it came time to trigger the broadcast. "If we do this, there will be fallout," he said, the soldier in him counting the cost. "People will die. Families will be targeted, will be hunted." "Then let it be on record who chose secrecy," Mara answered. Her voice had the evenness of someone who had decided to burn a life to save a world. If they fetch their guns, history will remember which side fired first. She keyed the transmission. The drive sent a bloom of data into 100 untraceable channels. Procurement lists, encoded video of Jonah's grafts, the contractor packet, Lila's file annotated with the little notes Mara had kept hidden. The translator narrated a plain, human summary: names, dates, places. For an instant, everything hung like a held breath. The lab a body waiting to see whether its heart would be given a new rhythm or silenced. Outside, a distant thrum matched the tremor in Mara's bones, the Coalition's emergency lift bringing armored units. Inside, as the first external warnings splashed across consoles, the world began to answer. Phones bloomed with kips. Journalists pinged back with secure confirmations. NGOs lit up. A public feed, seeded minutes earlier, cracked into the mainstream. A story that had teeth. Panic threaded through the channels. Yes, but so did outrage and an urgent insistence on accountability. In the chaos that followed, choices multiplied into costs. A contractor tried to discredit Jonah with doctored footage. A coalition official leaked denials. But the packet had wings. It could not be fully retracted. People recognized the human faces inside the files: mothers, clerks, students, a sister named Lila whose handwriting trailed like a ghost. The moral ledger shifted as protests and legal inquiries rose. Elias paid his price first. An arrest warrant materialized within days. He let himself be taken, but not before slipping Mara a small, folded note: "Be brave." Inside the cell, he would be a martyr or a scapegoat. Outside, his scandal would fuel reform. Jonah, cleared by public pressure, volunteered to testify before a tribunal that still smelled of coal and old paper. His graft made him central to legal debates about consent and modification. Mara, for all she feared, became the unlikely linchpin: scientist, witness, sister. At dawn, when the Antarctic light went thin and fragile over the ice, Mara stood at the viewport with Jonah beside her. The broadcast had done what they'd intended. It made the ledger visible and gave people a choice. Jonah took her hand, his graft humming faintly like a distant engine. "You were always brave," he said. "No," she answered, "I was frightened, and I did it anyway." She let the confession be small, a private truth wrapped between them. Jonah leaned in, their foreheads touching, sharing breath like a pact. Behind them, the world reorganized, coalitions reshuffled, contractors investigated, survivors finding one another in message boards and legal clinics. The emissary remained in containment, its patient gaze unmoved by human chaos, but its single sentence had unmoored a system. It had spoken truth. Humanity had chosen to answer. Mara watched the pale sun pool on the ice and felt, for the first time since Lila's photograph had looked up at her from a file, that recognition could be given and transformed. They had used the alien sentence like a scalpel, not to wound but to reveal. The cost was not small: Elias in chains, Jonah a public symbol braided with shame and dignity. But it had been paid willingly. In that thin light, with wind that smelled of change, Mara understood that love could be the most ferocious kind of rebellion. The Antarctic sun thinned into a wash of gold and blue, and for a single long moment, Mara let herself believe the world could be remade from the shards they had thrown into the light. Elias was in custody. News feeds called him a traitor and a whistleblower in the same breath. Public opinion split between gratitude and condemnation, but nothing undid the fact that he had chosen to hand the ledger to people who could argue with a conscience. Jonah became both witness and symbol, subpoenaed, examined, lauded, reviled. He answered questions with a voice that sometimes cracked and sometimes held steady like wire. Every time he spoke in court or to cameras, he felt the graft humming under his skin, as if the alien tissue listened and learned from the cadence of his honesty. Mara moved through the aftermath like someone who had learned to map a changing coastline. She cataloged interviews, annotated manifests, met with lawyers, and sat with survivors who had been turned into case studies. She slept poorly, waking to the echo of the emissary's sentence like a bell she could not unring. The world around her recoiled and then recomposed. Governments instituted inquiries, private firms scrambled to hide contractual traces. Protest movements formed around funerary rituals and data rights. The emissary stayed locked beneath reinforced ice and plexiglass, its presence a wound the public could not stop staring at. Scientists requested access and were rebuffed. Activists demanded transparency and were co-opted. Families demanded justice and were given committees. In quieter spaces, where cameras did not live, Mara found small mercies. Jonah and she walked the perimeter of the facility once the alarms had simmered down, hands clasped with a steadiness born of shared risk. He no longer flinched when the graft thrummed. Sometimes he laughed at the strangest things, a fragile happiness that made Mara ache with both hope and sorrow. She visited Lila's grave in a cemetery far from the ice, speaking aloud the things she had once written only in margins. She left a small, chipped stone that bore both their names. Elias sent letters from detention, short, sometimes furious, sometimes apologetic, smeared with the ink of a life rewritten. They read like maps back to a man Mara had never stopped needing. Legal battles and public reckonings churned, but the most radical change was quieter. People began to ask whether their grief was private or commodified, and communities reasserted rituals that refused quantification. Funerals moved back from spectacle to intimacy in neighborhoods that had once been optimized. Songs were sung not for their harvest value, but for their stubborn tenderness. Jonah volunteered at a clinic for survivors, learning to be present without being a subject. Mara resumed work in the lab, not to translate for the emissary, but to build systems that protected boundary, consent, and memory. One evening, months after the broadcast, Mara stood again at the viewport, Jonah at her side. Below them, the ice rolled, an indifferent continent whose white could not be bribed or bargained with. The emissary's containment light blinked like a slow pulse, patient and alien and unchanged. Mara pressed her forehead to the glass and felt the cold there like truth. Jonah put his hand over hers, the graft under his skin a quiet, impossible humming that no ledger could reduce. They did not have all the answers. They had instead each other and a newly chosen covenant to protect what made them human by insisting its worth could not be measured by someone else's profit. Outside, a wind rose and carried the thin salt of distant sea. It swept across the ice and flung a spray of glittering snow toward the lab window. The flakes hit the glass and slid down into transient, intricate tracks, anonymous, fleeting, beautiful. Mara watched them and for the first time in a long time allowed herself a small, private smile. She had thought she wanted to be seen. What she had found was truer and harder, to see and to be responsible for the seeing. The sentence the emissary had spoken had been terrifying, surgical, clear. Its consequence had been choice. In the pale wash of that Antarctic dawn, with Jonah's hand in hers and the world rearranging around an ugly truth, Mara felt the fragile, ferocious life of that choice settle into them like warmth after a long winter.